The wind, sweeping across the hills of western Massachusetts in late August of 1786, carried not only the premonition of early autumn, but also the bitter taste of ash. It was the ash of burned hopes. In the town of Northampton, usually sleepy and immersed in its routine concerns, an unnatural, ringing silence reigned that day, broken only by a rhythmic, heavy sound. It was the sound of hundreds of boots striking the dry, packed earth. A column moved along the main road. There was no gleam of parade uniforms, golden epaulets, or fluttering silk banners. It was a procession of shadows, people dressed in homespun shirts, faded vests, and old, patched coats. But on the heads of many of them were tricorn hats with sprigs of evergreen hemlock pinned to them, a symbol that only a few years ago had signified belonging to the great struggle for freedom. These people, numbering about 1,500, were not marching to war against a foreign invader. They were marching to the county courthouse. In their ranks, one could see faces weathered by sun and wind, hands calloused from plow and axe, and eyes that held a mixture of deep weariness and fierce determination. Among them walked veterans of the Battle of Saratoga, heroes who had survived the icy hell of Valley Forge, people who had, with their own hands, forged the independence of the United States of America. Now, in a bitter irony of fate, they were marching to stop the work of justice in the very country they had birthed in the throes of war. Their goal was to physically block the courthouse doors, to prevent the judges from entering and commencing hearings. For every session of this court in recent months had ended the same way. The judge's gavel fell like an executioner's axe, and another family lost their farm. Another veteran was sent to debtor's prison. Another destiny was broken under the weight of insurmountable debts. To understand the full depth of the tragedy unfolding that day in Northampton, one must look away from this procession and consider the broader picture, the state in which the young republic found itself after the end of the War of Independence. The peace signed in Paris in 1783 brought political freedom, but economically it left the 13 colonies in ruins. The war had drained the country of all its resources. Fields were abandoned or burned, the merchant fleet destroyed or captured, and traditional markets in the British West Indies were closed to American ships. Britain, having recognized the independence of its former subjects, decided to punish them economically by cutting off the oxygen of free trade. The economic system of that time was a rigid hierarchical chain, each link of which pressed down on the next. At the top of this pyramid were London bankers and trading houses. They demanded payment from American importers, large merchants in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, in hard currency, gold and silver. The credit of trust in the young country was exhausted. Paper promissory notes were no longer accepted. Boston merchants, themselves caught in a vice, transmitted this pressure downwards to the owners of shops and stores in the rural hinterland. They, in turn, issued ultimatums to their only customers, the farmers. A farmer in Massachusetts lived in a world of barter. All year long he toiled from dawn to dusk, growing wheat, corn, and raising livestock. At the local store he borrowed tools, gunpowder, cloth, and sugar with the amounts recorded in the shopkeeper's ledger. Payment traditionally occurred after the harvest, when the debt was settled with grain, meat, or timber. But in the mid-1780s, the rules suddenly and cruelly changed. Shopkeepers, urged on by city merchants, stopped accepting goods. They demanded pounds sterling, gold guineas, silver Spanish reals, all things that simply did not exist in the countryside. the money supply in the country catastrophically shrank. Gold and silver flowed overseas to pay for European goods, leaving the domestic market drained of blood. The political climate in Massachusetts itself brought the situation to a boil. Unlike other states, where governments tried to soften the blow by issuing paper money or enacting laws allowing taxes to be paid with goods, power in Boston was in the hands of a hardline merchant elite. Governor James Bowdoin and the legislature, composed primarily of wealthy Eastern Seaboard merchants, decided that the honor of the state required all war debts to be paid in full and as quickly as possible. To this end, they introduced taxes that could only be called punitive. The land tax and the poll tax, levied on every man over 16, increased several-fold. The demand was categorical: only hard currency. For a veteran returning from the war, this was not just an injustice, it was a betrayal. Many of them had not received their pay for years. At the end of the war, the Continental Congress issued them promissory notes, paper certificates promising future payment. But soldiers needed to feed their families here and now. Speculators, with insider information and cash, traveled through villages, buying these certificates for 10 to 15 cents on the dollar of their face value. Exhausted by necessity, veterans sold their military merits for a pittance to buy a bag of flour. And now, when the state of Massachusetts raised taxes to redeem these very promissory notes at their full value, it turned out that farmers, through their taxes, were supposed to enrich the very speculators who had previously fleeced them. By 1786, the courts were flooded with debt collection lawsuits. The process was ruthless. If a farmer could not pay, the court confiscated his land, house, livestock, and tools. All of this was sold at auction for pennies, often to the same creditors. But if even that was not enough to cover the debt, the person was thrown into prison. Debtors' prisons of that era were places of horror: damp cellars without ventilation, a lack of basic hygiene, meager food that the prisoner often had to buy himself or beg from relatives. People rotted there alive, losing their health and human dignity, sharing a cell with actual criminals. In some counties of western Massachusetts, 1 in 3 heads of household was brought to court. It was an epidemic of bankruptcies, destroying the social fabric of society. The farmers tried to act through legal means. For several years, they gathered at town meetings, elected delegates to county conventions. They drew up petitions, written in a language of respect and humility, and sent them to Boston. In these documents, they asked not for charity, but for understanding. They asked for the capital to be moved from wealthy Boston to the center of the state, to reduce the influence of merchants. They asked to be allowed to pay taxes with goods. They asked for paper money to be issued to stimulate trade. But Boston remained deaf. For the coastal elite, these requests sounded like the whims of lazy commoners who had drunk away their farms and now wanted to live off others. Newspapers called the protesters scum and enemies of order. The very idea that the government should listen to the needs of the poor seemed to many legislators a dangerous heresy. It was in this atmosphere of despair that the movement that history would remember as Shays Rebellion was born. But at the very beginning, it had no single leader. It was a spontaneous fire, breaking out in several places at once. People called themselves, quote, "2, reviving the memory of a movement active in North Carolina before the Revolution. The philosophy of their actions was simple. The government is a mechanism, and if the mechanism breaks down and begins to harm people, the people have the right to, quote, 3. It. They did not consider themselves rebels. On the contrary, they saw themselves as the true guardians of the spirit of the American Revolution. Was it not for the same thing that they fought against King George III? Did the principle of quote, for, not apply here too, when the interests of the farmers were completely ignored in the legislature? Daniel Shays became the face of this rebellion almost by accident, although his biography made him an ideal symbol of what was happening. He was a man whose life could serve as an illustration for the story of America's creation. Born in poverty, he began his journey as a farmhand. When the first shots of the Revolution rang out, he immediately answered the call. The Battle of Lexington, the bloody Battle of Bunker Hill, the capture of Fort Ticonderoga, the decisive Battle of Saratoga. Shays was everywhere. He proved himself a talented and brave officer, rising to the rank of captain. Marquis de Lafayette, impressed by his valor, personally presented him with an elegant saber. But returning to his hometown of Pelham in 1780, Shays discovered that heroism did not convert into currency. He tried to run his farm, but debts grew like a snowball. Humiliation followed humiliation. First, he had to sell that very gifted saber, a symbol of his military honor, to pay part of his taxes. But that was not enough. The court had already issued an order to confiscate his farm. A man who had risked his life for the country for 5 years found himself facing complete ruin at the hands of that same country. Shays hesitated for a long time before joining the protesters. He was a man of order, accustomed to military discipline. But seeing his neighbors, also veterans, being dragged to prison, he realized that silence was tantamount to complicity. The tactic of blocking courts, applied in Northampton, quickly spread to other towns: Worcester, Great Barrington, Concord. These were not just mobs. They were organized detachments, operating according to military regulations. They posted sentries, had their own officers and a signaling system. The state authorities were shocked. Governor Bowdoin saw this as a direct challenge to state power. His reaction was harsh and uncompromising. He issued proclamations declaring the gatherings illegal and called on the local militia to suppress the unrest. But here the government faced an unexpected problem. The militia refused to shoot. When a sheriff in one of the counties ordered the militiamen to disperse a crowd of farmers, they simply lowered their muskets. In the ranks of the militia stood brothers, sons, and neighbors of those who stood opposite. "We will not shoot our own people to protect moneylenders," was the unspoken response. The enforcement system failed. Losing control over local law enforcement, Bowdoin and his supporters in Boston moved to more radical measures. The Riot Act was passed, allowing the crowd to be shot if it did not disperse within an hour after a manifesto was read. This was followed by the suspension of habeas corpus, the fundamental right to judicial protection, which allowed authorities to arrest anyone suspicious and hold them indefinitely without charge. This only added fuel to the fire. Moderate farmers who had hoped for dialogue now saw in the state government a tyrant, no better than the British monarch. The leaders of the movement, Shays, Luke Day, Eli Parsons, began to realize that the path of peaceful pressure was closing. Their rhetoric became harsher. They began to talk about marching on Boston, about overthrowing the aristocratic government, and establishing true popular power. In the winter of 1786, Massachusetts effectively split into two hostile camps. The west of the state was controlled by the rebels, the east by the government. Panic reigned in Boston. Wealthy merchants, realizing that the state treasury was empty and the governor could not raise an army, decided to act privately. In a few days, a huge sum, more than £6,000 sterling, was raised by subscription. With this money, an army of 4,400 men was hired. Major General Benjamin Lincoln, a respected veteran of the Revolution, a firm man loyal to the elite, was entrusted with commanding it. The situation took on a surreal character. A private army, paid for by corporate interests, was preparing to march against citizens defending their right to existence. And all this was happening under the banner of protecting democracy. The conflict entered a phase of inevitable military confrontation. Shays and his comrades understood that their hunting rifles and clubs were powerless against Lincoln's regular, well-armed army. They needed artillery. They needed gunpowder. The only place where all this could be obtained in sufficient quantity was the federal arsenal in the city of Springfield. The capture of the arsenal would have changed the balance of power, turning the peasant uprising into a full-fledged civil war with an unpredictable outcome. January 1787 was one of the coldest in history. Snowstorms swept the roads, frosts froze the rivers. Shays' army, numbering about 1,200 men, was approaching Springfield. People walked in light clothing. Many wrapped their feet in rags instead of boots. They were hungry and exhausted, but they were driven forward by the hope of victory that would free them from debts and prison. The capture plan was developed by 3 leaders. Shays was to approach from the east, Luke Day with his detachment from the west, across the Connecticut River, and Eli Parsons from the north. The attack was scheduled for January 25th. But in the chaos of war, the smallest detail can be fatal. Luke Day, assessing the condition of his men, decided that they were not ready for an attack on the appointed day. He wrote a note to Shays, stating that he would set out on January 26th, a day later. This scrap of paper, on which the fates of thousands of people depended, was given to a messenger. But the messenger never reached Shays. He was intercepted by government soldiers. Shays, unsuspecting, continued his movement, confident that his flanks would be covered and the attack would be threefold. General William Shepard held the arsenal's defenses. At his disposal were about 1,000 militiamen loyal to the government and, most importantly, the arsenal's artillery. Shepard knew he was outnumbered, but he also knew that behind him were thousands of muskets that must not fall into the hands of the rebels. On January 25th, around 4 in the afternoon, Shays' column emerged from the forest and moved across the snow-covered field towards the arsenal buildings. It was a scene worthy of ancient tragedy. On one side, farmers, veterans, demanding justice. On the other, their neighbors, following orders. Shays rode ahead on horseback. Shepard sent an adjutant with a demand to stop. Shays refused. He was confident that Shepard would not order to shoot to kill. After all, they had drunk ale together, fought against the British together. The psychology of __0_ played a cruel trick on the rebels. Shepard ordered warning shots from the howitzers over the heads of the advancing rebels. The roar of the cannons shook the air, and the cannonballs whistled over the column. But the rebels, taking this as a sign of indecision or a miss, only quickened their pace. They marched in a dense formation, shoulder to shoulder. The distance shortened. 300 yards, 200, 100. Everyone's nerves were stretched to the limit. When less than 100 yards remained to the defenders' positions, General Shepard, realizing that another minute and hand-to-hand combat would begin, in which his men would simply be crushed, gave the fateful order, quote, 1. The cannons roared, spewing a deadly charge. Grapeshot is not a single cannonball. It's a bag with hundreds of metal pellets, turning a cannon into a giant shotgun. The effect was terrifying. A leaden whirlwind crashed into the center of the rebel column. 4 men were killed on the spot. Their bodies, torn by metal, fell onto the white snow, instantly turning scarlet. Dozens were severely wounded. A cry of pain and horror drowned out the echo of the shots. At this moment, what Shays feared most happened. The morale of his unprofessional army collapsed. Seeing the blood and death of their comrades, the farmers panicked. The illusion of a bloodless regulation vanished. They faced real war, for which they were not psychologically prepared. The formation disintegrated. People threw down their weapons and fled, ignoring the commands of their officers. Shays and his officers tried to stop the rout, waving sabers and pleading for them to return to formation, but it was useless. The rebel army turned into an uncontrollable mob fleeing. The arsenal defenders didn't even pursue them with fire. One volley was enough to decide the outcome of the day. This defeat was the beginning of the end of the rebellion, but not the end of suffering. General Lincoln's army, which arrived soon after the events at the arsenal, began a methodical pursuit of Shays' scattered detachments. It was a chase across an icy wilderness. The rebels retreated north, towards the town of Petersham, hoping to regroup. Lincoln, aiming to deny them this opportunity, performed a maneuver that entered military history textbooks. On the night of February 3rd to 4th, a monstrous snowstorm erupted. The wind felled trees, and temperatures dropped to critical levels. Any sensible commander would have halted his troops, but Lincoln drove his soldiers forward. They covered 30 miles in one night, through blizzards and deep snow. Many soldiers suffered frostbite, but by morning they reached Petersham. The rebels, confident that no one would bother them in such weather, slept in houses and barns, warming themselves by the fires. The appearance of Lincoln's vanguard was a complete shock to them. Resistance was disorganized and brief. Most rebels surrendered or fled into the woods, abandoning their last supplies. Daniel Shays managed to escape on horseback, breaking through the cordons and fleeing to Vermont, which was then an independent republic and did not extradite fugitives. The military phase of the rebellion ended in complete defeat. However, it was at this moment that the events in Massachusetts began to exert their main influence on history, an ideological and political influence. News of Shays Rebellion spread across all states with lightning speed, growing with frightening details. In the letters exchanged by the Founding Fathers, genuine horror was palpable. George Washington, who was in well-deserved retirement in Mount Vernon, was deeply shaken. Henry Knox wrote to him, "They want to divide the property of the rich. They say that since they defended this country from the British, all the land rightfully belongs to them." For the elite, Virginia planters, New York merchants, Philadelphia bankers, Shays' Rebellion became an alarm signal, a siren wailing in the night. They saw in it the ghost of _2_, the rule of the mob. It became clear that the existing system of government, the Articles of Confederation, was absolutely untenable. The central government had neither the rights, nor the money, nor the forces to help the states suppress the rebellion. If the rebellion had been even slightly more successful, if Shays had seized the arsenal, the fire of civil war could have spread to other states where debtors were also on the verge of revolt. The United States could have disappeared before it even formed, torn apart by internal contradictions. It was the fear of a repeat of the "3" that became the decisive argument that compelled delegates to gather in Philadelphia in the spring of 1787. Washington, who hesitated until the last moment, agreed to lead the convention precisely under the influence of news from Massachusetts. In the stuffy hall of Independence Hall, the shadow of Daniel Shays was invisibly present at every table. When James Madison and Alexander Hamilton argued for the necessity of a strong federal government, the right to maintain a standing army, and the ability to intervene in the internal affairs of states to quote for, they pointed to the example of Massachusetts. The U.S. Constitution, this great document, was largely a reaction to the rebellion of simple farmers. A paradox of history. People who rebelled against strong authority, by their actions, accelerated the creation of an even more powerful centralized authority. The fate of the participants in the drama unfolded strangely. In the first weeks after the suppression of the rebellion, the courts handed down dozens of death sentences. 2 rebels, John Bly and Charles Rose, were publicly executed by hanging as a warning to others. But the thirst for revenge quickly gave way to political pragmatism. In the next elections to the Massachusetts legislature, the people, angered by the cruelty of the suppression, voted against the Merchant Party. Governor Bowdoin resoundingly lost the election to the popular John Hancock. The new administration embarked on a course of reconciliation. Taxes were lowered. Laws were passed prohibiting the seizure of tools and essential items from debtors. In fact, many of Shays' demands were met, albeit posthumously for the movement itself. Most participants in the rebellion received amnesty in exchange for an oath of allegiance. Daniel Shays himself, after living several years in exile, was also pardoned. However, he did not return to Massachusetts. He moved to New York State, where he lived modestly and quietly, trying not to draw attention to his past. He died in 1825, at the age of 78, in poverty but free. A simple inscription was carved on his tombstone, not mentioning that this man once made the foundations of the state tremble. However, the significance of Shays' Rebellion extends far beyond the historical chronicles of the 18th century. This event raised questions that democratic societies are still seeking answers to. Where does the fine line lie between legitimate civil disobedience and criminal rebellion? What should a citizen do if the law becomes a tool of oppression and legal avenues for protest are ineffective? Thomas Jefferson, observing the events from Paris, where he served as ambassador, expressed a thought that shocked many of his contemporaries. In a letter to Madison, he wrote, "A little rebellion now and then is a good thing. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." Jefferson saw in Shays' Rebellion not a disaster, but a sign of the nation's health. Proof that the spirit of liberty was alive, and the people were ready to defend their rights. The story of Daniel Shays and his _0_ is a reminder that state building does not end in palace halls and on battlefields. It is an endless process of seeking a balance between order and freedom, between the rights of a creditor and a person's right to life. Those 1,500 farmers standing in the dust outside the courthouse in Northampton lost their battle. They were dispersed with grape shot, their leaders declared criminals. But it was their desperate act that forced the American elite to realize a strong state cannot be built by ignoring the needs of the common person. The U.S. Constitution, which ensured stability and prosperity for centuries to come, was written with ink invisibly mixed with the blood shed in the snow near the Springfield Arsenal. And therein lies the greatest lesson of those events. Sometimes, for a system to become fairer, it needs to be shaken to its very foundations.